Welcome back everyone, Happy New Year! This will be my Spider-Man No Way Home video for all the changes that they made to Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's timeline of movies, because they made a lot of changes to the characters that basically changed the timeline of all their films. So if you're brand new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to get all the videos. There's a bunch of really big stuff coming up. And even though the movie's been out for several weeks, I will say one more big spoiler warning. Hopefully you've had a chance to see the movie. God help you if you haven't. But during the end of Spider-Man No Way Home, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's versions of Spider-Man helped Tom Holland cure all the Sinister Six characters, either depowering them, returning them to their original human forms, and in the case of Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin, removing all traces of the Goblin serum from his body, effectively erasing the Goblin personality. And just because Doctor Strange performs a second spell to make everyone forget Tom Holland's Peter Parker exists entirely, it does not erase what all three versions of Spider-Man have done to cure the Sinister Six characters, but the spell does send them all back to their original universes and the different time periods they all came from. Because all the Sinister Six villains had been pulled to the MCU right before the moments of their deaths, but Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's versions of Spider-Man were pulled from the present day of each of their universes, which is why they look so much older, but the Sinister Six characters look the same age as when they did in their last movies. For example, in real life, Tobey Maguire is now the same age as Willem Dafoe was when he played Green Goblin for the first time in that first Spider-Man movie. That's how long it's been. Don't you feel old now? So when Doctor Strange sends all these cured villains back, it effectively changes the endings of all the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, the endings of the Andrew Garfield Amazing Spider-Man movies. Like, all their timelines are different now. And I know there's some confusion as to whether Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield will remember Tom Holland's MCU Spider-Man or if the memory spell wiped them too, because the whole reason why everyone was brought to the MCU in the first place is because they knew a version of Peter Parker was Spider-Man. So just to clarify, the second spell doesn't make everyone forget about MCU Spider-Man, they just forget about MCU Peter Parker. So Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, all the Sinister Six films will remember 1, that there is a multiverse with other versions of Spider-Man out there, and 2, they'll remember the MCU Spider-Man who helped cure them. The only part that they'll forget is that MCU Peter Parker was part of all this. They'll think back on the adventure and just remember that other version of Spider-Man that helped them, like the other brother from the multiverse. I always wanted brothers. The writers of the movie did admit that there were some plot holes with the memory spell explainer unanswered questions, but the Marvel and Sony people intended to leave it to the Spider-Man 4 movie to answer all those lingering questions, like did the second spell also delete all the computer records of Peter Parker's birth, his school records, his social security number, stuff like that. They're basically saying they'll deal with that during Spider-Man 4. Like, whoever winds up making that movie, whoever directs it, will just make that decision. But now you ask, how are Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's timelines different? So you have to remember the Loki rules for time travel, and you also have to think of it as the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse because we're doing so much multiverse storytelling. Like, they've canonized the events of all the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movies, and the Tom Hardy Venom movies to the MCU now.
Changing the past doesn't change the future. Think about it. If you travel to the past, that past becomes your future. And your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future.
So Back to the Future is a bunch of bullshit?
So the way they explain time travel, the multiverse during Avengers Endgame, and the Loki series as well, is that you can't change your past. You can only create branch timelines from that original timeline. But funny side note, now Tobey Maguire's first Spider-Man movie is technically the first MCU movie. It's not Iron Man anymore. So what happens when all these villains and Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield get sent back to where they came from is that they are now variants in branch timeline versions of the events of all their movies, or at least where they came from. Because Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield didn't come from one of their movies, they came from points in their timelines way beyond where their previous movies ended. But starting with Green Goblin here, he suddenly shows up during this final fight at the end of the first Spider-Man movie. He's cured, he's not evil anymore. It's implied he doesn't die, like he's not impaled by his glider, and because it's only the older Tobey Maguire later in his timeline who experienced No Way Home, Norman Osborn here, like the new cured version, has to do a lot of fast talking to convince this young version of Tobey that he's better now, and just vows to make amends for what he's done. But now going forward in their timeline, he's a variant. He creates a branch timeline where he's no longer Green Goblin after this. Couple years go by, Norman Osborn is still alive for the events of Spider-Man 2 when Dr. Octopus has his accident with the arms. It sounds like he and Dr. Octopus knew each other prior to the events of both of their films, so because this version of Norman Osborn in this new branch timeline is good, he's able to help Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man deal with Dr. Octopus after he goes off the rails, save him even faster, and because Norman Osborn didn't die in this new branch timeline, his Harry Osborn doesn't wind up turning evil or becoming a version of Green Goblin. Then later in their timeline, when they get to the events of Spider-Man 3, Norman Osborn, who's good, Dr. Octopus, who's been cured as well, are still alive and able to help Tobey deal with the version of Venom that comes along and the version of Sandman that comes along and fix both of those situations without anybody else dying. So we'll call the branch timeline that's created by this Green Goblin that goes back cured the best possible timeline for a version of Tobey Maguire. Because in that timeline, nobody dies, everyone is still alive on that planet. This Dr. Octopus goes back to the end of Spider-Man 2. Now remember, he only changes things going forward, he doesn't change his past, so there's a version of Norman Osborn who still died in his universe. But let's assume that he goes back before he sacrificed himself, before he turned on the fusion reactor, so he's able to survive past the end of Spider-Man 2. He doesn't have to sacrifice himself. He'd still be alive for the events of a version of Spider-Man 3 and able to help Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man deal with Sandman and Venom and Harry Osborn, Green Goblin, because remember, a version of Green Goblin would have still died in that timeline. But he's able to help save everyone, so a version of Harry Osborn doesn't die in that timeline. And they're able to stop Venom faster, they're able to cure Sandman faster. Then this version of Sandman goes back to a branch timeline version of Spider-Man 3 where he doesn't wind up teaming up with Venom, making it easier for Tobey Maguire to stop Venom before he can kill Harry Osborn, Green Goblin. But in the timeline that he goes back to, Dr. Octopus still died during the events of Spider-Man 2 years prior. So that's why I say the best possible timeline for a version of Tobey Maguire would be the one that Green Goblin goes back to, changed. And it's the same branch timeline explainer for how the Andrew Garfield Amazing Spider-Man movies timeline changes. Lizard goes back to the end of Amazing Spider-Man 1, survives, then is able to help Andrew Garfield deal with a version of Electro and Green Goblin when they pop up later. They save everyone. This Harry Osborn probably never turns evil, never kills Gwen Stacy, so that's the best possible branch timeline for a version of Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. This Electro goes back to the end of Amazing Spider-Man 2 a little bit later in the timeline, is able to help Andrew Garfield. His subsequent fight with Green Goblin goes down a little bit differently, and he never winds up killing Gwen Stacy. But then we also have two other new branch timelines created by the older Tobey Maguire and older Andrew Garfield when they go back to the present day of each of their universes. When they go back, everything they experienced in their original movies still went down the exact same way, no changes there, like they didn't change any of their past, they only create a branch timeline with an alternate future, but they go forward in each of the new branch timelines with the knowledge that they were able to cure versions of their villains, like they have more hopeful, positive outlooks on their futures. Like this Andrew Garfield Spider-Man isn't bitter or rageful anymore, he starts turning back into more of a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man and makes his peace with Gwen Stacy's death. But he doesn't go back to a universe where she's alive. She's still dead for this version of Andrew. But because he goes back knowing about the multiverse and what they did, he knows there's versions of himself out there living with versions of Gwen Stacy who didn't die. I'd argue that the new branch timeline that this older Tobey Maguire creates when he goes back is the least changed of any of the characters. It's implied that he'd already made his peace with all the bad stuff that had happened to him, all the bad stuff that he'd done. He'd moved past it a long time ago and was living his best life with a version of Mary Jane. They had a family together, so he didn't change all that much during the film. He was the person giving all the pep talks to all the other versions of Spider-Man. It's really Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man that still had a lot of soul-searching to do, and obviously Tom Holland's Spider-Man changed the most of all of them. So if there are any questions about how the events of all the Tobey movies and all the Andrew movies changed, they didn't change the events of those movies, they just created new branch timelines for each of these versions that went back to where they came from. Every one of these characters that goes back changed at the end of the movie is now a variant living in a branch timeline version of their original movies. Like I said, it's not quite as complicated as it sounds. I'm sure there's still going to be a billion questions about little plot details. There's always going to be little minor plot holes that hopefully they answer with future movies. But if you do have any big questions about how everything works, just write them below in the comments and I'll try to address it during my future videos. I'll do more Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield videos in the future because there are rumors that they will be coming back for more movies in the future, for more crossovers. There's a bunch of big stuff coming up, so make sure you have alerts enabled for my channel so you don't miss anything. Everyone click here to learn about the Spider-Man No Way Home alternate ending for the Venom character in Venom deleted scenes, and click here for my full Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness trailer video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone stay safe, and Happy New Year!